Welcome to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Don sitting in the host chair today, but sitting next to me along for a ride in the magical What If machine is Alexis. So say hi to the folks, Lex.
Hello.
And today we're going to go back to a familiar place. We say this all the time, but I'm okay with this because there's so much of English history that plays well into historical what ifs. But as we were talking about off podcast, we're going to do a slightly different approach than the way we sort of go into this, because some of our guest hosts are actually better at working out more of a what did happen. So their alternate timelines, their forks, or more definitive row. A lot of times we just talk about how things could have been different versus actually casting a specific
We're going to play this one out today, guys.
Yeah, we're going to play this one out a little bit with a little bit more precision, which is one of the great things about the concept of counterfactuals and what ifs are you can make your what ifs be whatever your what ifs are going to be.
Yep.
And so today we're going to look at a what if, a fork in time, that deals with English history. It will cover some topics or areas that we've covered before. So let's just say that.
Yeah, you haven't listened to this episode before.
Although you may say, haven't I heard that before? Because again, we see a lot of the same themes that play out just because of what's going on in the world during this particular couple of hundred years in history. And the things that are particularly going out, in fact, is one of the things that I've come back to time and time again in the podcast, getting a better understanding of what went on as a result of the Reformation and the Renaissance, but particularly the Reformation. What was going on with the religious conflict inside of Christendom during this period of time and how that plays out and how that adjusts. And so today we'll pick up on some of those things, but we'll do it in a slightly different way.
Yep.
Is that a fair summary, Lex?
Yeah.
All right. So before we go and do that, now's probably a good time to warn you to fasten your seatbelts and get ready to go. But we'll take a quick break here before we come back, hear from some of the folks that help make the podcast possible. Then we come back, we're going to set up the introduction to this episode. Where we're going to go back and do a what if in English history that's going to sound familiar, but is not exactly the same.
Yep.
We'll be back in a bit.
Would groceries delivered to you in as fast as 1 hour save you a trip to the store? Instacart makes that possible thanks to personal shoppers in your area who hand-select items based on your preferences from the stores you love. And shopping multiple stores is possible on a single order. Instacart picks the freshest produce and even keeps your eggs safe, all while finding everything you usually buy, providing smart suggestions for new items, and even highlighting deals to help you save money. And now you get free delivery on your first order over $35. Let Instacart know we sent you and help support our show by following the link in the show notes. Instacart. Groceries delivered in as fast as 1 hour.
Welcome back to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. If you are looking for the what ifs of history, you found the right place, and so we're glad that you found us. So as we were setting up before we did the break there, Alexis, we're going to go back in English history.
Yes.
So what year are we going back to in English history?
1485.
1485, and I think we have a smarter than average group of listeners. I assume that we do. You wouldn't find yourself listening to this on a regular basis if you probably didn't know
A little bit,
probably a lot about history. So some of our listeners may have already guessed 1485, aha, I know exactly where we're going. But for those who maybe need a little help, that may include me, by the way, sometimes. For those who need a little help, what happened in 1485?
well, we're specifically going back to August of 1485. That might narrow it down a little bit more.
The Battle of Bosworth. And so who are the contestants?
Combatants?
Combatants, that's a better word. This English language has all kinds of words to choose from. That's what I like about it. Who are the combatants in the Battle of Bosworth?
That would be the reigning king, Richard III, and in the real timeline of history, the person who wins the battle, Henry Tudor, who becomes Henry VII.
Okay, so Richard is the last of the Plantagenet line.
Yes.
And then Henry, who in the real-time line, the historical what did,
Yes.
is the victor and founds the
Tudor
line.
dynasty. Yep.
Yeah. And if you're familiar with the War of the Roses and English history before this, what's significant about the Tudors? How do we sort of get to the Tudors?
So we get to the Tudors through the Battle of Bosworth, and we get to the Tudors because they are the descendants of the Lancastrian line. Richard III is the Yorkist line, so the Yorks and the Lancastrians were the two warring houses in the really, really long period called the War of the Roses.
Okay, and so we get down to Tudor almost being like a chosen, adopted name to sort of be a break from Lancaster and York, correct?
Yes, and also he's his father was a Tudor. It's a weird way that we go down the genealogical line. The family tree gets a little muddled, but yes.
Okay. And so in the real historical timeline, again, we always talk about the what did often before we talk about the what if. Richard loses the battle
And dies.
and loses his life, as
Yes.
is often the case in conflict here. And so he was the reigning king, and so he is basically dethroned, displaced by the Henry that will become Henry VII, who will be followed by Henry VIII, and all of the hilarity that ensues after that in English history.
Yeah, all the fun,
that we're so familiar with. So in this scenario, in our historical what if, breaking a different outcome at the Battle of Bosworth, we have a surviving Richard III. But without getting a lot, Richard III is one of the more interesting characters in history. He's also one of the more interesting characters, if you will, in literature because of Shakespeare's portrayal of him. Is hunchback the right word? I mean,
he had severe scoliosis.
Yeah,
so
he had a deformity that caused a physical deformity that caused him to be notable for that physical deformity.
yes.
So when he dies in 1485, he dies without
heirs.
Without heirs.
In the real timeline, he does have a son, but his son actually dies in 1484.
Okay.
So predeceases him in the real timeline.
And his wife had been Anne
Neville.
And what is her status in 1485?
She has also died as of August in 1485. She dies in March of 1485. So she is also dead.
Okay, so Richard is the King of England without a queen and without an heir.
Correct.
And he is now fighting for his survival in that position against the upstart Henry. And then, of course, in the real timeline, Henry's successful, and we go down that path. But in our timeline, this is our what if. This is our point of departure. The fork in the road
Yes.
of a fork in time is that we're going to have Richard be successful, and we're going to assume, I guess, that he kills the other. The outcome is the other way. Henry
Dies.
So we don't have a Henry VII.
Correct.
At least the Henry VII that we know from history.
Correct.
And so we have Richard on the throne in 1485, but he's been challenged. He has no queen,
Correct.
and he has no heir.
Correct.
So now we're heading down the what if. So now we get to make up whatever we want to as long as it's historically plausible, right? Okay. So in your mind, what happens now in our historical what if with a victorious Battle of Bosworth Richard III?
Well, now you have a victorious Richard III, who, again, is a widower with no child, so immediately he's probably thinking, I need a queen.
Okay. And so in our scenario and the way we sort of talked this out off podcast, where do you think is a likely place that he might go to get a queen?
First of all, he might go over to Portugal.
And why would he go to Portugal?
He would go to Portugal for a couple of reasons. One, England at this point, which again we'll get into a little bit as we go down the fork, but England is a Catholic nation at this point. He is a pretty devout Catholic, so Portugal is also very devout Catholic nation, and there's some daughters of marriageable age. Okay,
and so in our what if, in our scenario here, we're going to say that he marries Joanna. And as we were talking about off podcast, there's a lot of Joannas running around.
Yeah, we're going to try and keep the names straight, but they're going to hear a lot of Joannas, a lot of Margarets, and a lot of Edwards. So we're going to do our best to try and keep them straight.
Okay, so the Joanna that we're talking about here is Joanna of Portugal. not to be confused with Joanna, who is a princess of Spain in approximately the same time. She marries into
The Habsburgs.
So
Again, we'll talk about that.
gets connection with Germany as a result of that and all the things that happened there, the Holy Roman Empire and all of those fun things. Eventually Charles V and all kinds of other things flow from that in the real historical timeline. But the Joanna that we're talking about here is a Portuguese princess
Yes.
who originally loses her older brother, who would have been the heir to the throne. But then her younger brother is born. So she goes at one point from being the presumptive heir to now that she has a younger brother who is living to adulthood and ultimately produces offspring and has an heir. She has a little bit of freedom, actually.
She does.
And so in the real timeline, this Joanna never marries. In fact, she actually, she's been beatified. She's somewhat of a saint inside of for the Portuguese.
Yes.
So she lives in a convent. She never marries and thus never has any offspring. So the Joanna that we're talking about here in the real world is obviously a devout Catholic. She chooses to become a nun in a convent, even though she's of royal birth. But once she no longer needs to be married because of the need to produce an heir, because of what happens with her family, she goes a different path.
Correct.
Not in our timeline.
No. Actually, and what's important to note is in the real timeline, there was a marriage treaty between this Joanna and Richard. The thing that nullifies that, Richard dies.
So what I'm learned already today from A Fork in Time, the Alternate History podcast, is it's easier to fulfill a marriage treaty if you live.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is not some ridiculous speculation here.
No.
If the expectation would have been, had Richard lived and survived the battle, that he would have married this Joanna.
Correct. So we're not just plucking a random royal princess out of a convent. Things were in the works to get her out of the convent and for her to become Queen of England. The thing that stopped that was Richard dies. But in our timeline, Richard doesn't die.
Okay. Now, the challenge, though, is that even though she is marriageable, royal, Catholic, all the things, there was a treaty in place, all the things that made in the real timeline that just didn't become fulfilled because of Richard's death there. But there's a challenge because how old is she when 1485 rolls around?
She's 32.
She's 32, almost 33. And so...
Which doesn't sound very old.
But in this time, certainly for bearing children, for other things that are there...
It's basically menopausal age.
Yeah, it's marginal. It's marginal that you can guarantee that there's going to be offspring, that it's going to be offspring of the right sex.
And healthy.
Always a risk. I mean, it's easy, when we go back and look at these things, to realize how many folks died in childbirth, how many children, were very short-lived. I mean, this is just the nature of where science was, where medicine was, and the risks of bearing children.
Right.
Certainly are there. So under our scenario, Richard and Joanna marry as they were originally intended to marry. And what are we going to assume happens in terms of what's produced by their marriage?
We're going to assume that there was no offspring, or if there was offspring, again, mortality rate, they were very short-lived. So we're going to assume there was no fruit from that marriage.
Okay, so what we have now is a potential scenario brewing where Richard is aging. He has an older wife who has not been able to provide him with the appropriate heir.
Mm-hmm.
And so in our timeline, in our alternate fork, again, we're being a little bit more specific than we often are. What is your presumption that's going to happen here in this particular fork?
So if Joanna dies, I think you have the scenario of Richard... Well, we have to do a quick diversion for what happens in the real timeline first. So Richard III is the second son. His older brother is Edward IV. So you might be thinking, well, if Richard doesn't have heirs, let's just have the children, and there's multiple children of Edward IV, take over the throne. Problem with that is, the only reason Richard III is sitting on the throne is he had all those children declared illegitimate. So what Richard III is going to have to do is he's going to have to go to his younger brother, George, the Duke of Clarence, and he's going to have to make George's children his heirs.
Okay, so he is disinherited by declaring illegitimate his older brother's offspring.
Correct.
Okay, and this has happened before the Battle of Bosworth, before 1485. That's already been set in motion before there's any diversion from the what did to our what if.
Right. It happened in 1483, right after Edward IV dies.
Okay, so we have Richard's younger brother, George.
Who's also dead. He actually predeceases. He's actually executed by Edward IV.
Okay.
So he can't become the heir. So that's why we have to have his children.
So we're going to we're going to the nephews.
Yes.
Or nieces
Mm-hmm.
of Richard III because of the fact that he's eliminated the other nieces and nephews.
Correct.
And now he's got to go to the younger brother's nieces and nephews.
Correct.
Okay, so who are these people?
So there's a daughter, Margaret, and then Margaret has a younger brother, Edward.
Okay. Again, a lot of mixing of the real and the imagined here. In the real timeline, Edward leads a pretty interesting little young life, right?
Yes, so this Edward is Edward the Earl of Warwick, and he is about 10 years old when we get to the Battle of Bosworth in 1485. He's born in 1475. And he ends up in the Tower of London, again, because he's got a claim to the throne, and because of the real timeline and Edward and Richard III dying, Henry VII sees him as a threat. He's got a Plantagenet claim to the throne, so he's thrown into the tower. He actually, in the real timeline, is executed in 1499 because he's involved, not directly, indirectly, but he's involved in a plot to have him escape from the Tower of London and put on the throne.
Okay, so what makes our what if legitimate is the fact that Henry recognized him as enough of a potential claimant to the throne
To throw him in the tower.
to throw him in the tower and then ultimately to have him executed when something happened. So that provides a little bit of credibility to the idea that he had a claim
And a pretty serious claim to the throne.
And so making the jump down that he is now, given what's happened with Richard and Joanna previously of Portugal, not being able to produce offspring, his claim to the throne really is not any less valid. In fact, it's now more valid, right?
Right, and also, just a side note as well, you might be thinking, well, why isn't Richard going to marry again? This is already his second wife, and so I think it's not, again, I don't think it's out of the realm of possibility that he's like, I'm just not going to marry again, I'm just going to make my nephew my heir. It's fine.
And we're also making an assumption here, but we're also making an assumption that he's not going to take the path of the Henry VIII that never exists in our what-if timeline.
Correct.
Of choosing to set aside a queen solely because of the inability to produce an heir. In other words, create a situation where he has to get an annulment or a divorce. Again, now, with the same issues that arise there before, a staunchly Catholic queen consort of England being set aside because of the inability to produce an heir.
Correct.
Okay. I sort of like the scenario maybe where they did have a child, but the child dies. Again, very common scenario. So even more reason why there wouldn't have been the setting aside of her and creating a different set here. We sort of find ourselves suddenly in the situation where it's too late to produce an heir and there's no heir that's produced. So the logical heir is
The nephew.
The nephew, who is Edward.
Mm-hmm.
Now, we talked a little bit off podcast trying to figure out what number we're going to give this Edward if he becomes king. And I guess walk our listeners through that as best you can without confusing all of us.
Okay.
Remembering this is a audio medium in a scenario.
Yeah, I don't have charts I can show.
Yeah, this is one of those instances where you sort of wish maybe we should, if we were a YouTube channel, you'd have a lovely thing on the screen now, but this is a podcast, so we're going to have to use the power of words.
Yes, I have the chart in my head, so I'll do my best to explain the chart in my head. So I would say this Edward Earl of Warwick, who will eventually become our king in our timeline, would be Edward V. The reason I say it's Edward V is because Edward IV does have a son who briefly becomes Edward V. He is never crowned. He is actually thrown into the tower, and we never find out what happens to him. But I think if you have Richard III being successful at Bosworth, and then he's naming his heir Edward Earl of Warwick, who becomes a king, Richard will kind of say, by the way, you're going to become Edward V. We're going to act like that other Edward V didn't exist.
Even more legitimizing the fact that the other Edward V was never really an Edward V.
Correct.
Okay, so you replace...
Because originally when he asked what name, Dad asked what name, and I said, oh, Edward VI. And then I went, oh, wait, never mind. No. So,
Okay, so where we've managed to get to, I think, fairly effectively, I think people are probably if I'm following along, I'm guessing most of the listeners are following along, is we've managed to get through Richard's victory at the Battle of Bosworth to a scenario where his nephew has become the correct rightful heir because of who's lived and who's died, and we now have Edward V of the Plantagenet line on the throne. And we assumed we tried to put just a date around this. What date did we finally come to, sort of putting around that?
so I had Richard III dying in the same year that in the real timeline Henry VII dies, which is 1509, which does track. They were actually born in the same year, so they would have been the same age. He would have died at 57.
Okay, so he dies of a fairly decent old age for this particular time of 57, and Edward V is now King of England.
Yes.
And what is his religious affiliation?
He is very Catholic.
Okay, he's Catholic, and his father Richard, not his father, but his uncle Richard, and his aunt, who had been the Queen Consort, Joanna of Portugal, were Catholic. And so at this point, we have the continuation of Catholics on the throne of England.
Mm-hmm.
In the real timeline, that's the case as well, up until a certain point in Henry VIII's reign, when it becomes convenient for him, for the reasons we've talked about so many times and are so well known to most students of history. There's an English Reformation, that there is a Protestant movement. There's Protestantism inside of England for a lot of reasons. But Henry embraces that because that's a path, because the Pope will not give him the annulment and the divorce that he wants.
Yes, Henry VIII is very much a Protestant by convenience, not a Protestant by conviction.
Okay. So what we end up having here is now Edward V, a Catholic Edward V, who is on the throne.
Mm-hmm.
And there is the wave of Protestantism that is existing inside of England, but it's not backed by the throne as eventually it would be in the real timeline, where Henry VIII chooses to adopt that for reasons that are perhaps theologically in line with that. We won't even go down that path, but certainly are politically and convenient to his desires to set aside Catherine of Aragon and marry someone else.
Correct.
In the hopes of producing an heir. So the Edward V that we have now is on the throne. Do we get him married off to somebody?
I think we do.
So who do we think we get him married off to?
So there's a neighbor to the north of England on the same island.
There's another country on the island?
Yeah, I know. Shocker. That'd be Scotland.
Scotland. So what's the status of Scotland at this time?
They would be Protestant.
Okay, so we mentioned there's already some Protestant fever, if you will, in England. We mentioned that we've had a recently deceased Catholic king. And so your assumption down our what if, and it's our what if, so we can do whatever we want to, right, is that we're going to get Edward V. We just explained why he's Edward V. We're going to get him married off to now a princess of Scotland. And why do you think that might be the choice that's made in this scenario?
For a few reasons, and we're not completely Protestant in Scotland at that point, but we're going that direction in Scotland. There were connections, familial connections, between England and Scotland going back in the centuries. So I think it's not that far out of the realm of possibilities to try and unite those crowns. Also, in the real timeline of history, we have a child of Henry VII, Margaret, going up to Scotland and marrying James IV of Scotland. That's how we get James V. That's how we get Mary Queen of Scots. That's how we eventually get James VI of Scotland, James I of England. So I think we're just doing that in a different way.
Okay, sort of backwards.
Yes.
Okay, so there's going to be a Scottish princess that's sent down to marry Edward versus an English princess that's sent up to marry James.
Mm-hmm.
And so, again, more of a Protestant leaning, more tolerant of Protestants. So part of the reason for this marriage might be to create more of a unified, non-continental presence, England, Scotland being somewhat united, not getting involved in the politics that's going on inside of Europe, the power struggle that's going on, which is both political as well as religious. It's spilt over into the new world in the sense of Portugal and Spain are contesting the continent of South America and where the dividing line is going to be. There's a lot going on in a particular time in history. And so your speculations we were talking about off podcast is that part of the reason that a Catholic-leaning Edward V in our What If timeline may go seeking maybe a more favorable, less staunchly Catholic Protestant from Scotland to marry is for political and religious reasons to sort of create a sense of unity.
Correct. It's like they might have taken a look around Europe and went, we're kind of all over the place. Let's just keep it on the island. Let's just unite together.
And as we talked about, you may say, wait a second, what about this Joanna from Portugal? How's Portugal going to feel about, I guess a less enthusiastic form of Catholicism on the English throne? Well, there's no heir.
Yeah, there's no skin in the game for Portugal anymore.
Right. And so while the princess goes, in the real timeline, she did not impact the descendants and family trees because she went to the convent, never married.
Right.
And so we really haven't altered or rippled the real elements of European history and who married who and who did what. Except that we don't have the scenario where there's been Henry VII and that's Henry VIII. And so when Edward goes and looks for a bride in Scotland, he's not going to where? To Spain.
No.
Which is what Henry VIII did. At the insistence of his father, Henry the Seventh. And so we don't have... And the purpose of that marriage in the real timeline was to create some unity between Spain and England.
Correct.
Yeah. And so ultimately when Catherine... All the things that go on with Arthur's death... See a previous episode, one of the early episodes of the podcast. Several episodes where this comes up. You don't have this connection between England and Spain because you now suddenly have the connection between England and Scotland. Mm-hmm. But you also don't have the English Reformation occurring quite the same way. So maybe it's a kinder, gentler...
Yeah, it's not the drastic, swinging, polar opposite Reformation that in the real timeline does happen in England. We have this Edward VI, who's very, very Protestant, then this massive swing all the way back with Mary I, who's super, super Catholic, and then you get this kind of middle ground with Elizabeth I. You don't have that. It's just kind of this naturally occurring... I don't want to say harmonious, because I think when there's religious tension, I think there's going to be conflict, but it's definitely more harmonious and more natural of a progression and of a reformation in England.
Okay, so this is now bringing us to the latter part of the 16th century. It always messes with my head to add the 1 to the numbers that are there. So in the latter part of the 1500s, the latter part of the 16th century, and at least in what we talked about, what we've speculated here, we have a more peaceful, absent civil strife England. Mm-hmm. We have relations that exist between England and Scotland that are now closer tied because of the marriage. One of the things that I suggested, one of the things that I was curious about, and we can talk a little bit about here, is we still have the long-standing animosity that has existed between England and France. We're not that far removed from the end of the Hundred Years' War, and of course the constant claims by every English king that he's rightfully the king of France, and by every French king that he's rightfully the king of England yeah. And all the battle over the area of Aquitaine and how much English possession would be existing on the continent. That's already taken place in the past. But now if you don't have England going back and forth through some of these things, maybe there's more of an English influence either in the New World mm-hmm. or on the continent, right?
I think so. I think definitely in the New World. That's definitely a place. If they're unified and they're not squabbling amongst themselves like they do in the real timeline, I think you're able to go further reaching out, and I think the New World is the most logical place for that influence to go.
Yeah, and the other thing, we've talked about this, I think we actually talked about this also on several other podcast episodes. A lot of the English colonization of the New World were religious separatists.
Yep.
Those that were coming to the Puritans, others that came to the New World, fleeing at various points different parts of the religious persecution that's actually going on in England because of that pendulum that seems to swing Catholic Protestant back and forth. So I think what you're arguing is there still would have been an English element of colonization or push in the New World, but it would have been more of the state in an organized fashion doing that versus here come some set of Englishmen who are fleeing something to come over to the new shores.
Right. I think it would have been more of a business venture. You would have seen more traders, merchants, people who were more focused on the business side and more on the investment side than more, we're just trying to get out because we're trying to not be persecuted because of our religion.
So is it a fair thing to say you would have seen more of English colonization, English exploration in the New World looking a lot more like the way that Spain did it versus the way that it actually happened in the real timeline?
Definitely.
Okay. And so that plays out, and obviously the ripples that we can go from there would be pretty immense. And although not quite the same, maybe missionary fervor type of scenario that also came with the Spanish conquistadors and the others. Okay, so we have, again, this unified or more unified, peacefully transitioning England. The relationships between England and Scotland are not acrimonious because they are bound by blood. And so Edward V, and are we going to give this Scottish princess a name?
I have Joan because that is a name in Scottish history, and we've gone with Joanna a couple times. So let's call her Joan.
Okay, so Joan and Edward are she's the Queen Consort of England. He's the King of England. Now, in our alternate timeline here, they have offspring, right?
Yes.
And we're going to assume that they have a male heir.
Mm-hmm.
And what are we going to name that male?
I'm going to name him James.
Going to name him James. So who is this, our James versus the real historical James?
So, in the real historical timeline, we've mentioned Margaret, the daughter of Henry VII. Even I have to stop and think to make sure I'm saying the names right, because they a lot of them are the same. In the real timeline, we have Margaret Tudor, the daughter of Henry VII, who has a son, James V, who has a daughter, Mary Queen of Scots, who has a son, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. In our timeline, we have Edward V, our Edward V, marrying a princess of Scotland, let's call her Joan, and they are having James VI of Scotland, who will become James I of England, because let's just say that whoever Joan's father is, let's say it's James V, with a different person, he will become the heir of Scotland, so we'll have a uniting of the crowns, and so we'll get the same name that we have in the real timeline, but it will be a completely different person.
Okay, so we end up with a James VI of Scotland, James I of England, in roughly the same time frame of the real histories, James VI of Scotland, James I of England. Mm-hmm. Comes to it a slightly different way, and we do unify the crowns. Mm-hmm. So all we did here was take a little detour around and came back to the same place.
On paper, yes. When you're looking at it, you're like, oh, James I. Yes. But it's a completely different person, and we're dealing with completely different genealogical bloodlines to get to those same names.
And the James here, and now the James, we're going to call him James the First, going
yes.
in assuming his English crown name. So the James the First that we have here is maybe Catholic, maybe Protestant. We haven't necessarily said how we think that's going to play out. Maybe we'll get definitive about that. But he assumes the throne without having to be invited to come and take it because of all that's gone on before that. And it's, like you said, it's the same name, but this is the King James of the King James Bible in the real timeline.
Correct, yeah.
But this is not that King James.
No.
Okay.
Do we get a King James Bible?
Well, that's the question that I was about to ask. So I'm going to throw it back at you. Do we get a King James Bible? Because the question is at this point, and we talked about this a little off podcast, but we didn't come to a conclusion, so I'm putting you on the spot now, is do we end up ultimately with a Catholic England or Protestant England?
I think we ultimately get to a Protestant England, but again, it's a very naturally occurring, very slow moving transition. So I think this James the First that we are discussing, I think he is a Protestant leaning, Protestant tolerating Catholic. I don't think he's quite made the Protestant leap yet. I think he's still on the Catholic side, but he's almost like Elizabeth I in my head, is how I'm kind of seeing him. He's kind of this, of course, Elizabeth I in our real timeline was Protestant, but she was tolerant of Catholics. So I think it's kind of the other way. He's Catholic, but he's tolerant of Protestants, and it's possible that he might have authorized the King James Version, the authorized version, the English language version of the Bible. But I think it's more likely that it would have been his son, maybe, let's call him James II, because we would have kept moving on that naturally occurring timeline of becoming more Protestant.
Okay. And then there's so much that happens. Again, we've talked about this in other episodes. We'll come back to it again because it's a popular place to go. It's a place that Alexis enjoys. I enjoy going there too. We still have a lot of other instances where there's jumps to different family lines that continues on down from this point forward. But at this point, we've had a solid Plantagenet line that's managed to make it all the way from 1485 to, we're assuming, the first part of the 17th century here.
Well, I mean, we're talking Plantagenets, we're going back to the 1100s.
Yeah, but I'm talking about just from the Battle of Bosworth.
Yes.
The Richard not being the end of the Plantagenet line, but the Plantagenet line continuing on now for at least another century.
Correct.
Okay. And of course, the risk is always there at some point that somebody's going to come along and not produce an heir, not live, the other things that has to happen from that. But if you think about how many times in the 17th century there was also turmoil inside of England because of just the turmoil. I mean, you ultimately have the English Civil War. You have still some going back and forth between some Jameses and some Charleses and all of that fun stuff that's going on there. Again, you may have this much more stable England.
Correct.
And again, the way this plays out, I think we've almost come down this exact same path before, is that if you think about it, it's a different group of Englishmen that come over to settle the New World. So the Englishmen that are coming to America, what will eventually become the colonies that eventually will become, at least in the real timeline, the United States of America. Eventually there's a revolution. I think it's not impossible to imagine, again, a very different set of English colonization, and with a different spirit in terms of how they came, why they came, what they're about. Maybe they're a lot more English than what actually came.
Mm-hmm.
And so you ultimately get down to this scenario where, one of the impacts of what happens, the field at Bosworth in 1485, is you ultimately don't end up with the same type of scenario going on in the New World in North America. You may not end up with the United States as you know it today.
Correct.
I think that's not the last time we went down this point of departure, I don't think it's a super radical, it seems radical once you get far enough down the line, but if it logically progresses along as being not that radical. And so you end up again with a different England. A different England produces
a different America.
Right. And that's part of the reason I think we keep coming back to these as topics, being Americans and just the general flow of history, is that the influence is not just contained to that little bitty island or set of islands up there, the British Isles, but it comes back to having a much greater impact because of the Commonwealth offspring.
Right.
That goes on from that. Okay, so in this particular what if, we've sort of taken a circle. It seems like we just took the detour and came back to the road, but again, it's not the same Edward, it's not the same James, and it's not the same England, right?
Correct. And so it's not the same America.
Right. So what else is a result of this time? Anything else?
I think we pretty much covered it. It's just, again, Dad said it, so I'll reiterate. The reason why this period of history is so fascinating to me, and why we come back to it so many times, is this is the period of history that, when you think England, this is the period of history you are thinking of. I was listening to another podcast recently, which talks about the kings and queens of England. If you have a book of the kings and queens of England, who is most likely going to be on the cover of that book?
I'm guessing it's Elizabeth.
Or Henry VIII.
Right.
Which, in our timeline, Neither of those people exist.
Yeah, in fact, the thing that I mentioned off podcast, and I think you just set me up for this, is that it seems like we took a detour off the road, took the side road, came back to the main road.
And got back to where we were going to be in the first place.
Although we've already talked about it, it's not that. Except that in the process, we got rid of every image you've ever seen by going to a Renaissance festival or a Renaissance fair, the Henry VIII, character. And we've also gotten rid of every major English monarch role that Kate Blanchett has ever played. Because we got rid of Elizabeth. And we've talked about this also a number of times on the podcast. As you said, it's either going to be Henry VIII or I think it's going to be or Elizabeth. These are the two most likely things that you're going to see, is that we lose both of those personalities of history and what that means.
Correct.
And that's not a small thing.
No, those figures are what makes England as we know it England. So again, while we're talking about a lot of the same names, and it's easy to just be like, oh, we got to the same plight. We didn't, and the England that we're talking about in this scenario is dramatically different than the England that we know.
And those differences are not necessarily bad differences, they are just differences. Because again, I think you have a much less strife-ridden religious turmoil that goes on in England.
Right.
But you probably don't have an Anglican church.
No.
England may still be, to this day, predominantly
Catholic
nation, or a mixture of Protestantism and Catholicism that might be an example of how that could have existed more side by side earlier than what we actually got in the real timeline. Mm-hmm. And I think that's a fascinating thing to think about as well. All right. I don't have anything else. You got anything else?
We also killed off one of my favorite characters in English history because there's no reason for... She still exists, but there's no reason for her to be important.
There's still an Anne Boleyn.
Yeah, but not in the same way.
Not in the same way. And by the way, again, we lose everything you've ever thought about with Renaissance Festival or fail. I mentioned the Kate Blanchett thing. You've also lost a little series called the Tudors in the process.
We're just killing a bunch of pop culture here.
We're killing a lot of media. A lot of media died today because Richard didn't die in 1485 at the Battle of Bosworth. All right. We thank you for joining us today on A Fork in Time, the Alternate History Podcast. Again, as always, we appreciate your time. And just to close out with the quick things we normally close out with here, visit the website, www.aforkintimepodcast.com. And we're going to stop now and get my mouth in motion. The A is important. The podcast is important to get to the right place. Again, you'll find the entire back catalog there, the opportunity to leave feedback. I'm specifically going to encourage feedback on this episode so that we know that there's just people out there. And so I particularly want feedback. We're going to invite this. We talked about we go to England often. Mm-hmm. So I'm actually going to throw this out there for our listeners who have bothered to stick to us here. We're about roughly 44 minutes, I think, into the podcast at this point. I want feedback specifically, and this will not hurt Alexis's feelings. She'll just go and create her own podcast if she has to, probably. But do we go to this well too often? I think that we don't. We do try to balance it. In fact, one of the things that I received today, I was very pleased to see feedback that we got from a listener. Alexis, I don't think you've even seen it yet. The feedback was that we don't do just the standard stock alternate history stuff. What would have happened if Germany wins World War II? What happens if the South wins the Civil War? We've covered those types of topics, and we will come back to them again because they are also influential topics in history and influential topics in the alternate history genre. But we make a point of trying to go to different places.
A little more obscure places.
Yeah, we do. And that's actually an intentional thing that we do. But part of the reason we, as Alexa said, we keep coming back to a lot of times English history, it's a rich mine to go and pull good stuff out of. And there's a lot of potential what-ifs that seem similar, but they're not. I guess that's the other thing that's here. A lot of them still get wrapped up in the Catholic Protestant issues. They get wrapped up in the things that go on with that because they can't help but get wrapped up in that. But there's still different flavors of that alternate history. But we're going to specifically ask if you like us going there, tell us you like us going there. If you like, you go there too often, I want that feedback. We can put in a stipulation or a rule that we'll only do it a certain percentage of a time.
Yeah. Not to say we won't ever go back, but
Yeah, but I'm specifically want feedback on this particular point. I know that it's something that we talk about, but there's a good reason for it. A lot of it is that one of the two founders of this podcast loves that area of history, and she's very fluent in it, which is a good place for us to go. So I'm going to ask particularly for feedback on that. That also is the other thing you can do at the website is, which is topic suggestions. Don't just say what you like or don't like. If you have a particular suggestion, give us that particular suggestion. You'll find it there, and there's a place to do that. What about social media, Lex?
So we are on Facebook, we are also on Twitter, and we are on Pinterest, so you can join us there. One of the things we do every week is we share the episode on our social media, so that's a good way to share it to the people that you know that you might think would find us interesting. So you can check us out there. And again, I love seeing comments on our Facebook and on our different social media. So you can definitely connect with us there. And we do check that and we do respond.
We do.
So,
we do. I responded back to the input that we received earlier today. And by the way, the other thing that person did, it's still there on the website. It's still going on in the world. The same person that gave us the feedback today, Lex, I know you haven't seen this, did a COVID check-in for us.
oh, good. Yes, that's still happening.
Yeah, so they're from North Carolina, said that they were doing great. They were adjusting to the new normal. So if you're a listener, particularly if you're a long-time listener, we see the map that's on our Buzzsprout feedback, sort of knowing where downloads are happening and where listeners are. Those are just lines on a table. Those are just dots on a map. We want to associate somebody there with them. So
Yeah, we want the people behind the dot.
yeah, so if you feel free to take advantage of the COVID check-in, let us know where you're listening from and that you and yours are all okay. And certainly we continue to lift up in our prayers just everything that's going on globally. 2020 has been 2020's been quite a year.
April was the longest year of my life.
Absolutely. So again, we encourage you to do that. And of course, the other things you can do there on the website we've talked about before. Links to our Patreon page if you want to support the podcast financially.
Entire back catalog is there too.
That's correct, and it's all free. So it's a good chance to catch back up. One of the things I'm actually going to start doing on a regular basis, again, these things you just pop on your co-host of a podcast in the middle of the recording instead of telling them off air. I mentioned, I think in our last episode, just looking at some of just the different statistics about which episodes are most popular. Going to make a regular point probably of at least once a month on the website, posting sort of the top 10 so that folks can see what's trending, what's there. I'm astonished when I look at which episodes get traction. I think I understand why they do in many instances, but sometimes it's a mystery to me as there's an episode that I think was a solo episode. In fact, I know it was a solo episode by me on Carthage that for whatever reason stands out among, you can see the noticeable difference in the graph. And so if somebody out there really liked Carthage Control, which is the name of that episode, tell me why. I think it was an okay episode. I'm proud of it, but I just don't understand why it picked up traction when there are other good episodes around it. So little things like that, going to give a little bit more of the feedback. I mentioned having Brody on. I'm going to continue to tease that. Brody has a podcast called What If? Brody's a high school student. So one of the things I'm most proud of, and we'll talk about this when we have Brody on, is I don't think I would have had the guts to do what we do here. It took me until I was 50-ish to do this. Brody's doing this at a much earlier age.
I'm in communications and I wouldn't have done this in high school, so good job, Brody.
Yeah. So I encourage you to check out the podcast. There are other podcasts as well. One of the things I actually would like to do is reach out again. If there are any other of our listeners who have their own podcast or are familiar with another podcast they want us to promote, I am perfectly okay with doing that. And I see Alexis nodding her head. She is as well. So give us that feedback as well. I think there is, we talk about a community, the alternate history community. It's not so large that there's not too much of this out there. So anything that we can do to draw attention to it, I think is a good thing.
Yeah, we're not competitors.
Right. We're not trying to crush them. In an alternate universe, we might be doing that, but we're not doing that
Not in this one.
Not in this universe. All right. Again, once again, we thank you for your time and thank you for your attention. We realize even if you do something else while you listen, it may not be commuting because commuting is not what it used to be, but whatever you do.
I listen on my commute from Galveston, where I live, to Houston, where my parents live, so that's a commute.
Yeah. But whatever you do to give us your time, we do appreciate that, and we try to respect that and try to bring you something that we think is educational and we hope entertaining as well at the same time. So Signing off for myself, I'll let Alexis sign off for herself.
Thanks for listening, guys.
And what we'll say is what we always say. If you happen down and encounter a fork in time, our advice is to do what?
Take it.
All right. Have a great day, guys.
Thanks for listening to A Fork in Time, the alternate history podcast. Learn more about the podcast at www.aforkintimepodcast.com. Join us next time.